Hello everyone. Oh my goodness, some familiar faces here and some new ones. So nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I hope you have all recovered from last night. How was it? Pretty good. Hey? Today I am so delighted to be chatting to you about my favourite topic, which is accessibility, if you know me. And my talk is titled Full Stack Accessibility and the Business Case for Inclusion. I'm really excited to share this one with you all. So, in the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups. I spent all my time on that slide. The rest is just dot points. So I want to start off with a little bit of law and order. Hot off the press, very recently, you might have heard about the Domino's accessibility law case in the United States. Can I get a show of hands of who's heard about that one? Cool, so about a third of the room. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. So a court case was taken to the Supreme Court recently, around July and August this year, very, very recent, where a user with vision impairment sued Domino's US because their website was inaccessible. This is the documentation. It's very, very cool. I love the font, very old font style. And straight away, it was incredibly, oh, sorry, it's a bit shiny, incredibly bad press for Domino's in the US. And Domino's actually decided to petition against the court case and the plaintiff that they didn't need to make their website accessible because the person could just call up and order pizza at the physical store. What ended up happening was things not going so well for Domino's in the US. And the court, following the Americans with Disabilities Act, ruled against the petition to make the website accessible. So Domino's, in the end, has to keep adding accessibility features to their website. And this is actually a really, really exciting thing in the accessibility community. It was a huge win for web accessibility because this is the first case where someone has won for a case where there was a physical store and an online service that was inaccessible. And cases in accessibility have actually grown tremendously in the US, where more and more people are taking a stand against businesses to make sure that their websites do not discriminate against those who do not have all of their abilities. So, what am I doing up here, and who am I? My name is Larene Le Gassick. I'm from sunny Brisbane. Thank you so much for having me back. This is my second time at NDC. What a wonderful event. Thank you to the organisers, you folks, the speakers as well. Awesome, awesome event. So I made up this job title. I'm an inclusion engineer, but I'm also a community director for Women Who Code Brisbane and another meetup called CTO School Brisbane. And I am an ex-consultant. I worked for a company called ThoughtWorks 5 years ago. I started a company called ThoughtWorks 5 years ago. I'm an eater of snacks and I am a cyclist. So what is an inclusion engineer? It's a dev who won't shut up about color contrast and HTML form labels. That's my definition of it anyway, because that's what I find myself doing most of the time. So what am I doing here? My story actually also started with pizza. So when I first started with ThoughtWorks, my first client was Domino's Australia, ironically enough. And they were actually the ones who introduced me to web accessibility and web content accessibility guidelines, or WCAG, which I'll explain a little bit about later. So I had spent my life growing up with a visually impaired father. He has a condition called retinitis pigmentosa, where he can only see a little tunnel of his vision. And so I grew up helping him learn how to use a screen reader on a computer, and so I thought this whole accessibility thing, I actually didn't know what that word meant, but I thought this was just a normal part of life. And then I became a professional software developer and joined Domino's, and they said, we need to make our website WCAG 2.0 AA compliant. And I went, what is that? And that's when my accessibility journey started not so long ago. So since then, every client that I would go on to, I would have a little side hustle where I would give a brown bag or a lunch and learn, relative to snacks again, and I would share my knowledge of what I've learned about accessibility and why it's important. And I found that every time I did leave a client, there would be old friends and colleagues sending me messages and pictures of little posters, for example, that they printed about accessibility that they've hung out around their office to remind them to build for everybody and be inclusive when they're building software. Little things like that. And so that's why I've decided to take on this job full time. So what is accessibility? Who here has heard of accessibility before? Okay, cool. Just for those who haven't heard of it before or might be new to software development, web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And that's the definition from the W3 Consortium, the committee that defines the standards for the World Wide Web. And on the screen here, I have a little snippet of one of the success factors or rules from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. So the WCAG the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were also defined by the W3 Consortium, and I have one of the example rules here, which is making something on the web distinguishable. And one tip is that color must not be used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. And so there are a couple of hundred rules like this, and it's probably the least accessible document that I've ever read. It's a lot of rules, a lot of vague language, but it's there for a reason, and it's very, very good to have a read over if you get a chance. But I'm mentioning it now because it does relate to something that I will talk about a little bit later in my presentation. So I want to do a little bit of an exercise around different experiences on the web for people with different abilities. And I also want to use numbers to back this up, so I'll have some statistics on the screen. So, 384,000 users in Australia with low or no vision. And on the screen I have a picture of me typing a tweet saying, "Can't wait to go to this," and a picture of an event, Women Who Code in Brisbane, with the date and the location on it. This is actually happening if you guys want to come. And this is what people who can't see images on the screen will see. And instead of showing a screen reader demo, I wanted to show what the actual experience is for someone who cannot see images if you don't put alt text on them correctly, or if you forget to label them. And for those who do need to use a screen reader, this is what the transcript might sound like. Larene LG tweet, "Can't wait to go to this," image, end tweet. So a screen reader is an assistive technology that is used by some folks with low vision or blindness, and there's various different software that come on different systems. The most popular ones are NVDA on Windows and VoiceOver on Mac. The VoiceOver actually comes for free on Mac, and I do recommend that you learn it if you do want to test for accessibility of the things that you build. So yeah, that's a bit of a no-no. Please make sure you do alt tags for your tweets. Unfortunately, Twitter doesn't make it that easy. You have to go deep into your settings and tick a box that says, "I want to be able to write alternative text for my tweets." Okay. Let's Let's see if this works. Here is also another common problem I see on the web, which is forms. So I'm going to let you listen to what a screen reader sounds like when it's trying to navigate an inaccessible form. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and try and listen to the screen reader.
Mozilla Firefox document. Page up, move, navigation toolbar, combo box collapsed, search document. Edit as autocomplete blank. Edit as autocomplete blank. Browser tabs toolbar, tab control, localhost :8000/inaccessible basic form/tabs.
So for those who can see the screen, you can also see there is a transcript. So this is NVDA on Windows, and it's a person using a screen reader navigating through a website using keyboard shortcuts. Usually those who use screen readers don't use a mouse. And on the right-hand side, NVDA comes with a log viewer, so you can actually see the script. The same thing happens for VoiceOver on Mac as well. And you can see or hear that when the person navigates to the username and passwords fields, even though you can see that there are labels for username and password, the screen reader actually says edit has autocomplete blank. Edit has autocomplete blank. So it means that there's an edit field. It has autocomplete functionalities, which is like filling in your credit card details or address automatically. And blank is saying that the input is currently blank. But it actually doesn't tell the person what they're actually importing, what they're actually needing to enter into the input. So this is a very, very common problem on the web. And that is probably totally inaccessible, the red. Oh my goodness. Should I do some live? No, that's okay. Here's a screenshot. So what I've got at the top here is usually the HTML for the reason why that inaccessible form happens. We have spans around the label, the username and the password, and then we have the inputs underneath. The reasons for that are usually, we want to style stuff, and spans are easier to style potentially. That's really hard to read. And the alternatives, there's a couple of alternatives for this and really, really easy fixes. We're transforming. Oh. All right, let's wait for that one. I'll try and explain it while we're waiting. So this first one is, instead of using spans, we use labels. More semantic HTML. And so we put the label username text inside of a label element, and we have the for attribute to say that this is for the input with the ID username. And the same for password as well. So that's one way that you can do it. Another way is, did you want to take a picture of that? All good? Another way is, what's this one? Using the aria-labeled by attribute. So you may have heard of aria before. They are, the first rule of aria is to not use aria. In the aria content authoring guidelines, they actually recommend that you try and use semantic HTML as much as you can, and aria is for the more dynamic, interactive components of the web, and don't use it unless you absolutely have to, for the risk of making something more inaccessible. Thank you so much for putting down the blinds, that's much better. And so that's one alternative as well. And the final alternative, I saw on the web that this is described as a label hugging an input. So you surround an input with a label tag, and you can put the text in there as well. So those are three really, really quick fixes for inaccessibility of forms that you might have. All right, next one. In Australia, about 8% of males and 0.4% of females have a form of colour blindness. So on the screen we have two different forms. One's, you might have guessed, one is a good example, one is a bad example. I'm not going to ask if anyone's colourblind in the room, but on the left-hand side we have the first name and last name. They are highlighted in green, and the email address is highlighted in red, probably indicating that there was something wrong with it. There's actually no text in the form, but it's just for illustrative purposes. And on the right-hand side, we have another form with name, username, and email as well. And we have the username being validated as correct and OK to use, and the email address being invalid, so it has an error as well. And notice that there is a text underneath the form inputs describing what has happened, and also icons on the right-hand side to indicate, using an indicator other than color, that what the current status of the form is, or the current validity of the form is. So that actually is meeting the requirement that we saw earlier from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines of not just using color to indicate meaning on the page. And notice the difference for those who can see the screen that once someone has a form of color deficiency or color blindness, especially red-green color blindness, on the left-hand side you can't tell the difference between any of the boxes, and on the right-hand side you still can, because you have other ways of indicating that something is wrong. All right. 1 in 6 Australians are affected by hearing loss. Approximately 30,000 are deaf Auslan users with total hearing loss, and that's a statistic from 2006. It's probably higher now. And so on the left, I have a scene from a popular TV show, The Office. And it's two people talking, and there's a big red mark underneath saying that that's not good. Does anyone know what they're talking about? Except for the really avid Office fans. It's probably one of my favorite quotes. Sorry, I annoyed you with my friendship. So something really, really important, and there's a lot of video marketing these days on, for example, LinkedIn and social media, and making it accessible for those who can't hear. It's essential for them, but it also helps those people who may have forgotten their headphones on the train, or their AirPods have gone flat, like me, very often. But they still want to watch your content and understand what you're trying to say. Motor impairment, whether situational, temporary or permanent, for example, like myself. This is a case for where we want to make sure that the keyboard navigation of your website and the focus styles make sense to the user. So I'm very sorry, EB. I always use EB as an example. In this video, I am trying to just do something, and I press the tab button. Oops. Or I hit the next button. Hello. There we go. And spoiler alert, I had to press tab 16 times, but can you guess where I realized I was in the end? So the first time I get a focus outline is the button at the bottom of the screen on the Nintendo Switch. So I didn't know when I was on the menu or when I was on the search bar. And so that makes it very, very difficult to try and use the website. And if you cannot use a mouse at all, it makes it almost impossible. And so a good example of that, and just a reason why that might happen on a lot of websites is because focus outlines are quite ugly by default. And so a lot of teams are told to design to make it not ugly, and one of the solutions is to just get rid of it entirely. But here is a great example from the Gov.uk website of what nice focus outlines actually look like, and they can actually look really, really good. So on the screen, I've got a video of Gov.uk, and they're using a very thick yellow focus outline. And you can see exactly where on the page the person is when they're tabbing around using a nice yellow color. And you might notice as well in the top left-hand corner, there's a skip to main content so that the person doesn't have to keep tabbing through all the navigation stuff before they get to the main part of the screen. So that's a really, really nice website to copy. 11.2% of Australians report an anxiety-related conditions. So on the screen, I've got one of, I think, about 6 or 7 posters from, again, the UK government, they published a really, really accessible and easy to understand set of do's and don'ts of accessibility many, many years ago. And those were the accessibility posters I was talking about that my clients would print out, laminate, and send me pictures of. It was really cute. And so on here I've got an example of a do and don't for designing for users with anxiety. And it's around, for example, if you're purchasing something online, you might have a time limit. And so you need to make sure how much time do you give that user to complete the task to make sure that they're not stressed out. And so what it says here, that to do, give users enough time to complete an action, and don't rush users or set impractical time limits. And there's another poster as well that talks about dyslexia. And people with dyslexia, how to design content and text and typography that makes the web more accessible for those people. So, any questions about that so far? All good? Oh, yes? Hey, Daz. Good.
The red-green colour blindness thing, that seems to be like a fairly common colour blindness, but green is often used for success messages or, correct input, and red is used for, validation and things like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that a convention that should evolve so that, for example, that form, they probably see that as black and white. Is that something that should evolve for websites, or?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I guess it's having multiple ways of indicating the meaning, because green is something that society is used to as being good, and red is something being bad. So I don't know if that's something that will be moved away from soon. But it's a good question and something interesting to think about. But yeah, now there is probably pretty standard iconography like ticks and X's and the warning symbol that make it really easy to choose, to not have to think too much about the icons you choose for it as well.
Yeah. So as long as you've got those multiple indicators, it's, I guess you can't get the rest of the population to change what they're used to. Like with traffic lights, you wouldn't change the colour of those. That would probably cause a lot of problems.
Probably. And sorry, I forgot to repeat the question, but just for the video, someone asked if maybe we were moving away from the green and red symbolism for good and bad in terms of validation. And yeah, awesome.
Sorry, can I just ask a question on that?
Yep.
Screen? How does the screen reader deal with the one on the right? So it's visually, it's more appealing because you've got your usernames are valid,
Mm-hmm.
emails are valid, you've got the iconography, but what's the screen reader going to look at? Will that play back to the person with vision impairment as it's being presented to the screen?
Yep, so the question was, what does the screen reader do with the icons and the message? Is that right? So yeah, one of the most common tiny problems that I see around the web with Font Awesome, do you use Font Awesome by any chance? Is that when it is decorative like so, you can put an aria hidden tag on it. And so that actually gets ignored by the screen reader because it doesn't mean anything to the person, but the screen reader will probably tab, and there's a few different strategies to making validation messages. Oops, I'll put caffeine on, sorry. If I can get my mouse back. Rookie. Where was I? Yeah, so there's a few strategies for screen to be able to make validations of forms accessible and actually more user-friendly to everyone. For example, when you do submit the form, do you want to put all the messages about the errors at the top so that you put the focus back to the top? And so a screen reader user can read through the list of errors, and so can a person who may be able to see the screen as well. They can see straight away how much stuff they've done wrong. But otherwise, yeah, you would probably put the screen reader's focus to the one with the problem, and then they can tab through to the error message as well. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Okay. So I love data, I love stats, I love experiments and research. So I want to talk to you all about the WebAIM Million. Who knows about this experiment? So WebAIM is an organisation called Web Accessibility in Mind. That's what WebAIM stands for. And they publish a lot of articles, do a lot of great research about the general state of web accessibility. And they also do consulting and things like that as well. So very recently, in February this year, they did a project where they found the top 1 million most visited homepages, note just the homepages, on the web, and ran an automated accessibility auditing tool through it, or scanner through it. And the one specifically that they used, in case you've heard of it, is Wave. So if you search for Wave Accessibility Scanner, you can actually put in your own website and scan it, and it will give you a list of errors. And that's created by WebAIM as well. So, how do you think it went? Thumbs down. Yeah, everyone's shaking their head. Not too many positive people. Who thinks it went well? Who thinks we're doing good? One hand. Spoiler is, yeah, I'm standing up here because we're probably not doing that great. Anyone want to guess a number of, or percentage of, how many websites had at least one WCAG 2 violation? 80%? 95? 100? Is this Price is Right rules? Do we? All right, cool. The number in your head. So on the screen, haven't revealed yet. On the screen, I have a bar graph of the most common problems, with the vertical axis being percentage of home pages, and the horizontal axis being the most common problems that the automated tool can pick up. Now, the disclaimer is an automated tool. Even if you pass it, it doesn't mean that your website is accessible. There are still a bunch of manual checks that you would need to do, and also things like how do you get an automated tool to check if your content actually makes sense and isn't a whole lot of bollocks. I don't know, machine learning's coming, so we'll see what happens. So the number is, drum roll, 97.8% of the top 1 million home pages had at least one detectable WCAG 2 failure. That's okay, we're all right. So this also takes into account maybe people have focused on making the happy path accessible, and maybe there's errors on stuff that they didn't think were too important, on like little icons and things that don't necessarily mean that the user can't get their goal done. But it's pretty it's a pretty shocking number either way. So I really love the X icon. I just keep putting it through everything. The truth is, things have gotten worse since the days, probably the late 90s, early noughties, the days of where every website was a table and the background was a tiled, textured marble image. And what else was there? There were blinking things, and a little cat would follow your cursor around. Probably more accessible than a lot of the websites these days. And who can guess the reason for that? Yes?
Because we put a lot of emphasis on like layouts now, and they look fancy and they're minimal, and they're not like orderly laid out. Like table, it's not just tables anymore. It's like
Yeah.
tiles everywhere.
Yeah, not every website looks like Wikipedia, right? So yeah, one answer is everything's minimal, not everything's kind of laid out like a book or like a logical way. Is that what you're getting at? Yep. Anybody else? Yes, Emily?
Page applications.
Sorry?
Single page
Single page applications.
applications.
Yes. That is a part of it. And all right, so npm install crying face. I want to show you another stat that actually came out of the WebAIM Million project. So who here is a JavaScript developer and has worked with one of the fun new frameworks? Awesome. So about like half. I'm really bad at counting, so about half to 75% of the room. All right. Can someone yell out if they're not a front-end developer? What are they? Someone volunteer? Games developer. Yep. Back-end application cloud infrastructure. Cool. Anybody else? Back-end Java. Awesome. All right. This is like we're having a coffee chat. Nice to meet you all. All right, so let's get back to it. React. The results came back in a pretty data-heavy table. So I've summarized it down to you. So they tried to detect, firstly, they detected content management systems like WordPress, for example, but they also detected what JavaScript libraries were included in the home pages and correlated the results of inaccessibility to that. So React was imported into 3.2% of the million home pages. And for websites that do include React, they have on average 65.5% WCAG failures, 65.5 individual WCAG errors or failures. And that's actually around 10% more than the average of all the million websites. Next one, Angular. 1.5%, so not as much as the internet, of the internet, and it goes up to 70.9 WCAG errors per page and around 20% more errors. And last but sadly not least, Vue, our new friend. I love Vue. A little bit less again, so almost around 7,000 home pages. Goes up to 73.7 errors per page, or 24% more than the average number of errors. All right. Is everyone depressed now? It's not all bad, but I do have one more quote to show you, and I'm going to give you a bit of warning. When I read this quote, it kind of really punched me in the guts, so just a bit of warning. So I recently read a book by Kat Holmes. She was a UX designer at Microsoft. She played a big part in one of a really, really awesome thing to come out of Microsoft called the Accessibility Toolkit. I do recommend you look it up. It's a bunch of PDFs talking about web accessibility and inclusive design. And she wrote a book after or during her time at Microsoft called Mismatch, which talks about disability not being an attribute of a person or a medical condition, but actually a mismatch between a person's abilities and their environment. That mismatch is actually the disability and not a problem with the person themselves. And in the book, she does a bit of call to action to builders and designers. For better or worse, the people who design the touch points of society determine who can participate and who's left out, often unwittingly. Wow, I just butchered that quote. And so in her book, she does talk a lot about exclusion, and that if we don't make the conscious decision to be inclusive, we are actually going to unwittingly exclude people. And an example she uses is a study that they did with kids in the playground, where if you leave kids to do their own version of play, they will maybe pick teams, pick the best player at sports, and we all know about what it feels like to be left out in a playground. And so they did a study of enforcing the children to make sure they include everyone when they play. And despite initial concerns that would make the play less fun, it actually bred a really interesting and new and innovative mode of play, which was really, really cool. It actually aligns with the same concept in web accessibility as well, and inclusive design. Constraints do breed innovation. All right, who feels a bit like this sad panda with his back facing to you? So that's how I felt after doing a little bit of homework on the state of things in web accessibility today. But I'm not here to make you feel bad about yourselves. I didn't know, I that I built a lot of inaccessible things in the past, and I'm still on my journey myself. And so what I want to do is just make sure to raise awareness and share with you as much as I can, so that we can all make sure we don't forget little things to make the web more inclusive. Okay. All right, so back to my title, Full Stack Accessibility. I have pancakes behind it, or pikelets, depends what you're into. I like pancakes. So what is full stack accessibility? And on the screen, so I've got a bunch of white lines at the bottom. So we talk about full stack developers, where they can move between different parts of the stack. And I'm going to talk about moving between different parts of the stack and how that relates to accessibility. And it's a really great opportunity to be able to be mindful and build accessibility in, to your organization, the way you work, and your culture as well. So I'm going to start in the middle of the stack. So in the middle of the stack, usually when you think accessibility, who is the person most responsible for it? You probably think of designer or user experience designer. And generally this is the case. And so designer, they take care of color contrast, layout, typography, data visualization, forms, mobile, user flow, and user testing. And so these are all responsibilities or actions that designers do already, but being mindful about being inclusive for each of those is really, really important. For example, for color contrast, making sure that it does meet the standard. There was a bit of a fad maybe 5-10 years ago where designers seem to really, really like everything being grey, medium grey. And there's like dark grey on light grey. And the color contrast was actually quite poor for that. So a test I like to get myself and other people to do is called the Squint Test. But they're actually, so if you squint and you can't really make out what's going on the screen, your contrast is probably not that great. But there are tools and Chrome extensions that you can install that test your color contrasts, and the Wave accessibility scanner also does automated contrast testing as well. And the contrast ratio is defined in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And user testing, making sure that you build your product with those who have different abilities and disabilities, and make sure that you test with them as well. So not building for them, but building with them, so that you can get that feedback. And I find that's a really, really hard step, because not really many people know what that looks like. Do you go out and specifically look for someone who is blind to test your product? And the answer is actually yes, there are organizations out there who can go and source those people for you. UI developer. So that's the other person usually is pretty accountable for accessibility. And so UI developer takes care of semantic HTML, CSS, makes sure it's responsive, and probably shares taking care of the design system with the graphic designer. Oops. And they need to think about precursive enhancement, interactive JavaScript, and focus management. And recently I've done a bit of reading so I've strictly limited it to these kind of most important things, because I feel like the front-end developer is a bit ambiguous or vague these days, and sometimes they're stretched a little thin. And actually, I think that might be one of the main reasons why accessibility is suffering so much right now, especially in the ones with JavaScript frameworks, because I think JavaScript, and I've read that those front-end developers who are proficient with all the new frameworks like React, JavaScript, and Vue might not have so much depth in HTML and CSS. And that's okay. Like, doing JavaScript development is learning a lot of computer science as well, and doing like, oh gosh, where am I going with this? A lot of different and deeply complicated topics in terms of object-oriented, programming concepts that are very, very different to programming principles and concepts that a HTML, CSS person might need to know. And also the depth of HTML and CSS in terms of being able to make your components cross-browser compatible and accessible is a very, very large amount of knowledge to know as well and apply. So, moving away from the middle of the stack as we get further out. So I did hear there's some JavaScript developers in here and also back-end developers. But I'm also going to talk about on the other end of things, so content and marketing. So content and marketing takes care of content and writing. Hopefully you do get your content, or at least the tone for your content for your products from your content or marketing team. But they also run events in social media, images. They take care of maybe your stock images or your photography, emails, PDFs, and print. So maybe your email campaigns and video and audio as well. And so, for example, I've seen places that maybe have accessible websites or web products might not have an accessible email marketing campaign because they've done a really nice image-based campaign that looks really, really cool in your inbox, but actually they forgot to add all the alt tags to the images to be able to make it accessible to everyone, or add a plain text alternative. So there's things like that that other parts of the company do need to think about as well. Social media is a big one, making sure that you do alt text and also captions for things that you put on LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter. And also making sure your content is in plain, simple language, and so that those with different abilities and different literacy can read and enjoy what your company has to offer. What else have I got there? Oh, and events. So making sure events are accessible as well. Is there wheelchair access? Is there accessible toilets? Is there different food options for different dietary requirements? Thinking about all those things to make events as inclusive as possible. Okay, and to the JavaScript developer. So JavaScript developer, and of course these aren't people, these are sets of responsibilities. People can have different mixes of different things. JavaScript developer primarily takes care of interaction, routing, and performance. So you probably hire one if you do want to do a single page app. And data and API and state management. So one of the biggest problems I do see with single page apps these days is that while the pages themselves might be accessible, we often forget to make sure that we let the user know that we have changed the route and changed the page. Because in a single page app, there is no refresh action, which is what triggers a screen reader to go to the top of the page and start to analyze and read out the page again. So yeah, a big problem in a lot of single page apps is that you click to go to another route or another part of the page, and the screen reader will just stay silent. They won't know that something has changed. All right, just being mindful of time. Sales and customer service. So being inclusive in a sales and a customer service role is incredibly useful for these attributes. So developing empathy with the customer and is really, really good for an excellent customer service experience. And great communication, openness to the customer's problems, cultural awareness, and also representation. So being able to interact with different customers and having customers also be able to, what's the word? Anyway, having different people so they can relate to each other. All right. And further down the technical stack, back-end developer, Devops, SRE. I'm not too phased about the job title. And so I've got a mix of different responsibilities in here. So again, with performance, so you might have seen performance come up a few times. That's because the next billion users are going to be in using very small phones on very strict data plans in countries like China, India, and Brazil. did I say million? Next billion users that are joining us on the internet. And so data and optimizing performance and API calls suddenly get really, really important. And of course, all the usual things also apply to accessibility as well. Data, having data be accessible, getting to the information that you want. If it's not in the database, it's pretty useless. Security, making sure that your servers are available, and making sure it's robust. And also a big one is one of the biggest bottlenecks of performance and data usage is image size. And so it's a really, really good idea and good for not only accessibility and people with low data plans, but also page rank in Google. If you have performant image sizes, that makes you more mobile friendly and therefore boosts your rank and your search engine optimization score. And also developer experience as well, making sure that if anything does go wrong, your developers can very quickly ship a change. Yeah, if there's feedback about something maybe being inaccessible. All right, so we also have the very top of the stack. Inclusive leadership as well as people in HR. I kind of lump them together. They do kind of similar things. So inclusive leadership, the attributes of those leaders are usually around courage, transparency, humility, trust and respect, and a commitment as well. They also set a strategy and a commitment for the company. They're aware of or cognizant of their bias and make sure that they lead in terms of being aware of their bias and being able to do something about it. Teaching and learning and sharing is usually an attribute of inclusive companies, as well as making sure that we have the policies in place to make sure that our workplaces are inclusive and are ready to support diverse workforces. Job access and environment. So making sure your environment is physically accessible to those who might have different abilities. And also one thing that I've seen a lot of, having worked at a jobs board website before, is there's a lot of online platforms that help manage your HR recruiting system where people upload resumes or read job ads and so on. Many of them are very inaccessible, so you're actually cutting out possibility of hiring potentially someone who can't access your jobs platform, which might be different to your products, which could be accessible. So yeah, something people don't often think of. All right. The business case for inclusion. So I did promise that I would tell you things to help you print money. So I'm going to share with you 5 business cases for inclusion. So the first one is innovation. So in history, there have been inventions that were built for the sake of disability or for those with different needs, and those have become widely adopted and become a normal part of our life. And there's a lot of inventions that you might know about that you might not realize were originally invented to solve a problem that someone had or a need that someone had. An example of that is curb cuts in the footpath. So that's a big concept that's called the curb cut concept. So back in, I think, the 40s or 50s, folks came back from the war in the United States, and a lot of them became wheelchair users. And they were trying to get around the campus at one of the universities, and they realized they couldn't get up and down the footpath to the road very easily. To cut a long story short, there was guerrilla gardening. Someone brought in a cement mixer, and they drilled into the footpath and cemented a slope from the top of the footpath down to the road so that their wheelchairs could get around. And then it became something that was installed everywhere and is now something we see on every single footpath around our city. So Another story is there was a company, there was an engineer actually, who had a problem with RSI, or I think he developed carpal tunnel syndrome from typing too much. And so he decided that he needed to fix that and have a solution for it where he didn't put strain on his arm from typing. And so he developed a touchpad where he could type so that he didn't have to put as much force down onto the keyboard. And so he created a product in a company called Fingerworks, which was later bought by a little company called Apple. And that has formed the basis of the base technology of the touchscreens that we all use every day. And also other technologies such as typewriters, email, telephone, Alexa and Google Assistant, all based on technologies that were invented to solve a need or a problem. So building for accessibility or inclusion is good for brand enhancement. So companies who display a genuine commitment to accessibility have increased brand recognition and reputation. An example of this that is also on the W3 website is Barclays Bank. And so they've done a survey of their company and they found that people are very, very proud to say that they work for or do business with Barclays because they have such a commitment to being inclusive. And other companies, really large ones that definitely are very public about their commitment is Apple, Microsoft, Dropbox, Google, and the UK government as well. Wider market reach. So I'm just scrolling the stats to make sure I get them right. So at least 1 billion people, this is from the World Bank in 2018, at least 1 billion people, 15% of the world's population have a recognized disability. And the rate of disability is rising as advances in medicine rises and as we get older and the population ages. And another study done by Forbes have estimated that globally the potential market reaches 2.3 billion people of those with disability or know someone with a disability who control approximately $6.9 trillion of annual disposable income. And that could be a potential retail opportunity that you're missing if you have an inaccessible online shop, for example. And another study done by Forrester and Microsoft have estimated that an average European company with 1 million site visits per day could see an estimated increased revenue of 2.3 million euros per year based on the percentage of users with disabilities who abandon online shopping carts. That's not a small number. Less legal and tech risk. So I started today's talk talking about the recent Domino's US case. Certain ones back home are including the Sydney Olympics website back in 2000. A person who used a braille reader couldn't purchase their ticket on time, so they missed out. And so they sued the Olympic Foundation because the website wasn't accessible. And they were awarded $20,000 in damages. Another more recent one is Coles Online. While it took a person who couldn't see the screen maybe around 4 to 6 hours to complete an online shopping cart, they were still able to do it, and it did give them that feeling of independence and being able to shop for themselves. However, in a rebrand, approximately 6 years after launching, it made the shopping cart completely inaccessible where the user couldn't pick a delivery time. So unfortunately it did end up in a court case, and I think they settled it quietly on the side. And actually, since we're at NDC, in Norway it is illegal to have an inaccessible digital product or website. So they do audits. I'm not sure how often, but if your website is audited to be found to be inaccessible, you have a certain amount of time to make it accessible, otherwise you will be hit with a fine. All right, almost there. Higher customer and employee satisfaction. So I've got a few more numbers for you. So actually the Diversity Council of Australia and Suncorp did a study together, and it also aligns with the Forrester and Microsoft study of employee engagement. in inclusive companies. So inclusive teams are 10 times more likely to be highly effective, 9 times more likely to innovate, 5 times more likely to provide excellent customer service, 19 times more likely to be satisfied with their job, and 4 times more likely to stay. And so that's the 5 business cases I have for you today. All right. So what about next steps? So in my last little bit, I'm going to give you, and it's a very, I realize very much death by bullet point here, but if you wanted to take a picture, but I'll go through them. Kind of steps, very high level steps to create a more inclusive company. And these are found and collated by various different blogs online, and I have all the references which I will share on my blog a little bit later when I type this up. So, refresh on accessibility basics and know when to consult the experts. If you are not comfortable in writing accessible HTML and CSS, maybe hire someone who is comfortable with it, or do a course on it. It's okay. Hire content creators, designers, and developers with accessibility knowledge if you can, or train them. And hire for diversity. We all know that diversity correlates with more revenue and better business success. Build with, not for people with disabilities, and hire them as well. Make sure that your job platform is accessible, and make sure you do invest in ongoing education and training. Build accessibility and inclusion into culture and processes. For example, there is a blog online by the Australian Australian Diversity Council that talks about how to use more inclusive language. So you notice when I talk about people with disability or people who are low vision, I use the word people first. That's one of the tips that I learned from that blog. And where was I? Build accessibility into products and services. For us, that's software. And make sure your partners and vendors care about accessibility too. So a big thing that I like to check when I use open source libraries, which are awesome, is just to make sure that the HTML is following accessibility standards. And that, for example, actually it was with you, Lyle. We were doing a React Native app, and it was very early days, and a lot of the libraries didn't have accessibility built in, but it was literally one attribute that we needed to add to an element to make it accessible. So we did a pull request and made sure that they put that change in, and we did a fork and used the library that way, I think. Something like that happened, yes. Nod and agree. And make sure that your partners and vendors care about it as well. For example, people would choose Barclays over maybe other financial partners because they care about accessibility, and that also correlates with maybe they're doing a lot of other things right as well, like privacy and security, which are very important for banks. And one thing that I've seen that kind of kicks off things is, does your company have a published accessibility statement? And so this is like a public commitment and accountability to making sure that your company is going to start to make an effort towards, or are already making an effort towards, being more inclusive. So here's an example of an accessibility action plan. It's a PDF, and this one is by the Commonwealth Bank. A lot of the banks have theirs online, and yeah, they're really, really interesting reads, and you can probably take a lot of things and see if you can apply them at your own workplace. All right. So, Positive Possum thinks you can do the thing. I have a giant possum on my screen, not the US kind, the cute Australian kind. I think it's a bushtail possum. So, while it does seem like the state of things are very bad, actually, there is not that much work to do to be able to make sure that we can start to make things inclusive and accessible, and try and make accessibility and reframe it so it's less like a chore and you don't think of like legal risk and litigation, and make it more about people and belonging. And I had to close off the day, sorry, not the day, gosh. Close off my talk, I would like to quote just some random web developer from the UK. I was watching a YouTube video and yeah, they have titled Web Developer for Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web. Hilarious but accurate. The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. The World Wide Web is the best chance we have for connection and belonging, and I hope that we can all work together to make sure we keep it that way. Thank you so much.